Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the Nation's Weekly Podcast. I'm here with my illustrious co-host, Claire. Claire, how are you doing today?
Fine, thank you.
Good.
How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm excited because of the guest that we have to introduce you to this week. He's been a dear friend and older brother, mentor, all sorts of things to me. His name is Jeff Reinke, and he has lived quite the life. So you're going to hear about some of that and some of what God has done in and through it and what he's passionate about. And it's good stuff. Jeff is many things. He's a husband, he's a father, he's a soon-to-be grandfather.
Yes.
He has been a multi-sport scholarship athlete. He's the founder and the director of a nonprofit called the Relationship Resource. He has been the marriage and family pastor at North Coast Calvary Chapel for the last 30 years. Congratulations.
Wow. I started when I was 8.
He's a nerd as well. The guy loves reading, loves studying. He's got a master's in education from Azusa Pacific, a master's in family therapy from Trinity School of Psychology, and he's also got a long background in ministry that's not the church. He's worked in parachurch as well. He was the director of FCA in San Diego,
Fellowship of Christian Athletes.
Yeah, and has been a coach and a mentor to all sorts of young people, married couples, you name it. Jeff can't help but find us delightfully broken people and encourage and inspire us. So I'm thrilled, Jeff. Thank you for coming and joining us for today's conversation here at Nations.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to meet you.
Same. Of course.
Before I ask you to share a little bit of your story and how you got here, I want to frame the conversation beyond just your accolades. The reason why you're sitting in this chair is because I consider you a reformer. I've had the privilege of working with you when I was on staff at North Coast. Got to watch you work to write this wonderful book, Badly Broken, Deeply Loved, How to Find God's Healing, Wholeness, and Peace. We got to work as co-hosts together on a different podcast project, the Free to Love podcast.
We got to do
shameless plug.
Yeah, we got to do part 2.
Yeah, we will. I consider you a reformer in a lot of ways because you, for the last 15 plus years in particular, as you've been developing the men's and women's skills and the marriage skills resources, you've looked at the church and said, hey, there's actually an area of brokenness here. We don't always know how to help people on their healing journey. We may be good at missions, or we may be good at evangelism, but when it comes to helping traumatized people, when it comes to helping people in recovery, when it comes to understanding just the healing journey, there's lots of resources that the church is really reluctant to engage with. The psychological community had lots of insights and modalities that for a long time the church looked at with suspicion. And particularly our own denomination, that was kind of a hallmark of it for a while, was this deep suspicion towards that whole field. And you actually looked at that and said, wait a second, I think that there's gold that we can mine here. We don't, there's critique, but there's also a lot that we can learn. And so,
metaphor.
Yeah, I've seen you as kind of a master synthesizer. This curriculum that you've built that I'm a facilitator for is this wonderful blend of biblical wisdom and insight and truth, blended with a lot of the insights from the fields of neuroscience and neurobiology, with traumatology, with just counseling best practices and some of the best insights of the psychological community, most notably the modality developed by Terry and Sharon Hargrave, restoration therapy. Mm-hmm. And so this was, it's been pretty common now. We live in very much a therapeutic age where the language of therapy is pretty popular and ubiquitous. There's no longer this stigma, particularly around our generation, about being in therapy and that just being a part of what it means to be a healthy human. But that wasn't the case when you started blazing some of this trail years ago. So I'm excited to hear more about that journey and to share with our audience some of just the wisdom that you've gleaned. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear just some of your story. How did you end up, the Jeff Reinke that you are today? Where did God show up in that?
Still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, well,
we're all on that journey, aren't we? You never figure it out completely. But thank you so much for having me. It's been a blessing to be able to partner with you in our past gathering together. You've helped me. I think you've given me great insight into not only have we done the podcast, but with the book. So I'm very grateful for our relationship and And I think we're going to be doing this for a while.
I hope so.
So part of understanding part of my story, and I'm not sure if you've just seen the movie Jesus Revolution.
Yeah.
So that's my story. And so for me to reflect back in the early 70s and to see this massive movement of the Spirit of God that came out of the hippie generation, it really took me back to that particular season of my life. And as I was in this place of, in many ways, I lived this dual reality. Is here I am, a two-sport athlete at USC. I played on 3 national championship baseball teams, was on the United States All-Star team against Japan. And then I played both, I went there on a basketball scholarship, but then ended up getting drafted by the Detroit Tigers and played a couple of years in the Tiger organization as a pitcher. And so in many ways, I lived an amazing life and very grateful, and I feel very gifted that I had that level of a talent and that sense of ability to be that successful in the world of athletics. And I did get injured. Yet I felt even after I got injured and I was finally released after 2 years, knowing my pain cycle, I thought I was a failure. But the reality was, as I'm living that part of my life, and I'm very grateful. And the world I lived in at USC was at the very height of the glory years of the USC Trojans, national championships in basketball, in baseball, football. And so these are the guys I hang out with.
Yeah.
But the other side of my life was during that particular generation and that season is drugs was pretty rampant. And so coming out of high school and jumping into college I was introduced to marijuana, and then that took me onto other harder drugs. And I found myself by my sophomore year, now I'm pretty part of my life story included substance abuse.
Yeah.
So that created a lot of confusion for me. And as I looked at Jesus Revolution, that just brought me back to that reality of how much this worldview of free love but this sense of institutional worldview and trying to find purpose and meaning and love in your life. And so it's pretty fascinating as I've been able to sit back in that season of my life. It's really been amazing for me to be so grateful and to give a greater sense of significance and meaning to that dark season of my life. For many of those years, I buried the shameful time of drugs and living a very promiscuous, crazy world. I buried all that because I lived that place of shame and guilt. For me to go back to it helped to understand my story and to be able to in a healthy way integrate how God was there with me the whole time, even in those deep moments of darkness. And I'll just give you one story. I remember going to a party down on Newport Peninsula, and the gentleman who, at his house, he was the founder of Quicksilver, and he gave me maybe we shouldn't put this on.
No, that's your...
But anyway, I remember he gave me a quarter hit of acid, and I had a really bad experience. This is my junior year in college, and had a really bad experience. And I remember this because I look at the story of the Jesus Revolution. This was pretty norm.
Yeah.
And I remember getting in my car, my little squareback Volkswagen, and driving back to USC, and I thought about taking my life. I was in so much pain. And so that took me to the very darkest, deepest part, coming to that place of real brokenness and recognizing I can't live this life anymore. Thinking about I can't live the pain, the confusion. And so when I got back into my apartment, for 3 nights in a row, I cried out to God. And so it wasn't like I went to church. It didn't like I had this, someone shared the 4 spiritual laws with me. Now there are other components. I know that God was already planting seeds, but being in my apartment all by myself in a place of deep darkness and pain and confusion, and crying out to God, that is literally within maybe it was a month. I remember I was at another party, took a hit of some marijuana, and I almost got sick to my stomach. And so at that moment, I could no longer do the drugs. So I'm kind of giving you a little bit of understanding from my story. It was when I was 21 years old, a senior year at USC, is when I asked Christ into my life at a small little row Bible study with about 20 people at USC. But God was already working in my life previous to that, but I kind of knew there's something going on. But as I reflect back on it now, that was the point in my life and dealing with this deep reality that I am really deeply broken. I am badly broken. and coming to a place of complete desperation, coming to the end of myself and realizing I can't do this anymore. So when I had this radical conversion experience in this small little Bible study on the row at USC, I remember the Holy Spirit coming upon me. It was a powerful experience. It was the first time in my life that I experienced the absence of shame or guilt, and the first time of true, deep love, and sensing this sense of inner peace that I've never experienced before. So that was the moment that took me on this new journey into really discovering what true spirituality, who Jesus was. And that entered me into begin this road of where I find myself today.
Yeah, because you didn't grow up probably dreaming, I'm going to be a marriage and family pastor at a church, and I'm going to
when I was 5 years old.
I'm going to found a nonprofit, focused on psychological well-being and emotionally healthy spirituality, recovery from addiction. You thought you were going to be a sports star, and you go on to do that. So you meet Jesus, you have this. What's interesting? A couple of things that are interesting to me that you just mentioned is, like you said, connecting it to the Jesus Revolution era and the hippie and kind of post-hippie space, where I loved how that movie pointed out that the hunger that young generation had for transcendence is an innate human one. We long to encounter a transcendent God, a transcendent reality that gives us this sense that there is more to life than just the material. There's more to life than just kind of the mundane rat race, that there's a story larger than ourselves that we can participate in. And I don't think I think we saw it really clearly during that cultural moment. And I think that I'm curious, do you feel like you're seeing that, that same sort of yearning and longing manifested in our own culture now?
Wow, that's a very good question. I've had some conversations with some dear friends of mine that in my generation who got saved during that season, reflecting back on what was that like for us in that particular generation, and where do we find this generation, obviously our children and grandchildren, where do we find ourselves now in our society, in our culture? And we've all agreed that we believe it's darker. We believe it's more complicated than it was when we had more of a black and white reality I just feel like it's more sophisticated, more complicated, and more confusing today. And so it's been obviously in having a conversation with my son and my daughter, they have not experienced, and when they saw the movie, I took them to go see the movie with me, and they're watching their dad cry, and then they started crying. And it's been my heart's desire that they could experience, that they had some sort of, this experience with God. And I feel very fortunate, even though it was a very painful and dark moment in my life, but I'm very grateful that I was able to see and experience the supernatural work of the Holy Spirit. I've seen, healing, and we've had this, you and I have had these conversations before, but I have been very fortunate. I've seen the real dark side of evil, being a counselor in the church and a therapist, of sitting with people who have experienced some pretty profound strongholds of darkness and demonic activities. And that's now actually more the norm. I mean, the world that we live in, and that's the world of my calling, is I see that world, I live in that world, and I feel very blessed that I'm able to sit with people and help them walk through that, because that was part of my journey and part of my story. So I think, it has been my passion, and it's been my heart's desire, is to be a vehicle to bring healing and wholeness and restoration and deliverance, because that's what I experienced. Mm-hmm. That's been part of my journey and my story. So how do I ended up become a pastor, and how I ended up overseeing a counseling center, it has really been birthed out of my pain, out of my journey from pain to peace, and experiencing, going to a place of deep loss and sorrow to amazing joy. And that's, to me, that's the tension, that's the reality that we find ourselves in this world.
Mm-hmm. Mm. I want to come back to something, unless you've got a question.
You can go for it.
I want to come back to something that you said there in a little bit, but how did you get from, so you get injured after being with the Tigers organization for a few years. And so that's a real turning point for you where, okay, so professional sports and the world of sports, which has been your whole life in so many ways, being highly competitive, being really gifted, that future is now gone.
Yes.
So I'm curious about how, okay, was your encounter with God and that sense of love, peace, well-being, and value, was that kind of an anchor for you during that time? And was that part of what guided you into the world of coaching and of ministry? And so, like, how did you end up going from professional sports track to vocational ministry track?
Yeah, well, that's, again, good question. So I believe my life, since I was 10 years old, was in the world of sports. And so after I was done playing minor league baseball, I received a job down at Southwestern Junior College in San Diego. That brought me to San Diego. Mm-hmm. And so my vocation was, it's a real natural vocation, me jump right into the sports world and coaching, because I had that experience. Mm-hmm. But on my advocation, as I'm pursuing coaching and athletics, and loved, I've loved coaching. It's just my passion. I mean, I think by nature, I'm a coach. Mm-hmm. I'm even a coach in the spiritual realm. That's where my passion is I'm on this journey of discovering who I am. Mm-hmm. And so I'll never forget when after I got released and I came back home, and we had my family and some friends, we had this party, just to welcome me. But it was fascinating to me is a lot of these people, they saw me in the identity as a sports figure. Mm-hmm. They knew me as a professional athlete or as a collegiate star. They did not know how to deal with me. Mm-hmm. This part of my life has now come to an end. They didn't know how to talk to me. Mm. Some people ignored me. Mm. And that was actually an interesting time of my life, because it brought me to a point of, in a sense, of disillusionment, and at the same time of a discovery of asking the question, where does my identity lie?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always been part of my journey. It's part of the struggle, is how much of my identity is grounded in my accolades and success and awards and affirmation. And so that drives, especially if you're in the world of athletics, that is going to dominate your sense of your personality. And as you know, people who have been in collegiate sports, is you become a very intense driven person, and how much of your sense of your identity is in your behavior and your success. Mm-hmm. So I'm sharing that with you because as I look at where I am today, part of my journey and discovery had to do with where is my identity? Where do I get my sense of value and purpose in life? And so that brought me down to San Diego, and I got involved in a church down here, and I immediately started serving, and I went to a rehab center, which is interesting. The first place I went to was a rehab center. There was in conjunction with a church who people were recovering, and I did a Bible study there. It was my first Bible study. I'd only been a Christian maybe for maybe a year and a half, 2 years, and already I'm opening the Bible and helping people who are in rehab or recovery to heal. So, and I had no training, I had no background. It's just something that I just jumped into, and so it's fascinating to reflect on these moments of how seeing the handprints of God directed me in this journey. So I think the journey has always been this process of, where does my sense of value come from, and who am I, and what really gives me a sense of significance and purpose in my life. And I remember taking some philosophy classes at Point Loma University when I was down there, because my brain is always, I have somewhat of a philosophical brain, so I'm always trying to analyze and research and understand. And I remember reading about James Sartre, who was a French existentialist. And I remember reading philosophy that really began to help me to anchor in the truths of scriptures. And he said the finite without an infinite reference points has no meaning. And so studying philosophy, and then the first book I ever read in the Bible was Ecclesiastes.
Oh, what a great one. But also, what a curveball.
It's crazy. So I remember sitting up at, here I am living at USC, and we've been called the University of Spoiled Children. And a lot of my friends, they're all, even now, look back at them now, they're all driving BMWs and Porsches, and I'm driving a little Volkswagen Bug, right? And I remember reading Ecclesiastes and just reading the very first chapter, and it says, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. It's like chasing after wind. And that sense of disillusionment with the world that I lived as an athlete, experienced great success, accolades and glory, it came to an end. And it was like, how do I live now to get rid of, my identity is no longer grounded in what I do. This was part of my journey and the opportunity I had to discover the goodness and the mercy and the grace of God as I begin my own journey, my own process.
Well, and I think that's also highly relatable, because everyone defines themselves and finds identity in what they do. Yeah. So it's important to have that bit of awareness. And I'm curious as to, I basically did a really quick read. I skimmed most of your book yesterday. Not all of it, but most of it. And you make some statements about, we've mentioned the state of the church and that there needs to be more integration and awareness. And would you say that the cornerstone of all of that is through identity?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I absolutely. It really is not in our behavior. And unfortunately, when we think about true spirituality, true spirituality is really anchored in who we are and whose we are, not what we do. Yeah. But I think that's the nature. That's the nature of our curse. That's the sinful nature that we battle with every single day. Is if you think about the temptations of Christ, and I remember Henry Nouwen. I'm a big fan of Henry Nouwen, who's a former priest, and he basically described the three temptations of Christ as: I am by what I do, I am by what people think I am, and I am by what I have and how much power I have. And those are three temptations. I mean, it's really simple. It's simple to understand. These are the temptations, not only that was presented to Christ when he was in the wilderness, in his 40 days, of fasting, but these are the temptations in our humanity we deal with every single day. Where are you anchoring your sense of purpose, significance, and your identity? Is it in what you do? Is it in what people say you are? Or is it in how much power you have and influence, and how much materialism, consumerism, which is at our heart of our culture? Or do you find your identity in the intrinsic value created in the infinite wisdom, divine love of God. And I agree with you. That's the journey we're all on. That's the journey of humanity.
And the church, I think if I'm hearing what some of you're saying, Claire, you're picking up on his book, is diagnosing that unfortunately the church, especially in the West, has maybe run afoul of that core message and has instead turned into these organizations that put a great deal of emphasis on behavior and behavior modification. That, hey, true spirituality equals moral behavior, or true spirituality equals right doctrine. If what I understand that you're just saying there, that, well, no, true spirituality actually begins at this level of identity, and that our identity has to be grounded in something other than that performance mentality, other than that perception, mentality, other than that power mentality. It's got to be rooted if we're going to be able to navigate those sorts of temptations, right? We have to do the work of saying, well, how can I actually re-understand myself and the way that I relate to God, and to develop a secure attachment, so that when the world of Ecclesiastes comes crashing in, the world of meaningless violence, of success that doesn't actually bring satisfaction, we have like a safe harbor to retreat to, which is what I hear you saying, this, hey, you're intrinsically valuable because you're created by a thoughtful, loving, relational God who delights in you.
Yeah, which is I'm sorry. Did you?
No.
Well, reflecting back on when that existential moment when I discovered Jesus during the Jesus movement, is the church at that time was very broken. I mean, the institutional church was a very strong, fundamental, sectarian, territorial place for people went there for protection, to preserve their sense of their, whatever, how they identified themselves. And so it's interesting how what broke out of that was when this pastor, in many ways, a man named Chuck Smith, who was not a successful pastor at a small little church, and he was willing to really take the risk of opening up the doors to homeless people, from street people, of Jesus, these young recovering addicts, and how that created a lot of conflict with the church at that time. And so the stark contrast of the simplicity and the power of God's love that transcends all institutions, we see that hit the local church in the 70s. And then we see this in Southern California, this great movement where then Jesus was met outside the four walls of the institutional church. And we see this great movement of love that was touching the hearts of this younger generation that was not grounded in the institutional church. I'm not anyway dismissing how that they opened the doors to the sense of simplicity in the and I think that what we call that back then, it was like a new wineskin, which I don't think it's really a new wineskin. It was really the original essence of what true spirituality and the love of Jesus is. I would say what my experience in Calvary Chapel is, in many ways, the church has regressed back to its old form of institutionalism, sectarianism, preservation, maintaining a sense of the existence of our local congregations. So in order to do that, we've adopted a lot of the culture's values of power and control, consumerism, and kind of more sense of marketing. And that's the tension, because the church, the local church, evangelicalism, has adopted the culture's ethics, I believe. That's how I perceive this. And as you said, my story is coming to know Jesus not in the local church, and then ending up working in the local church. I had a love-hate relationship. I remember going to seminary, and at the time when I went to seminary, Gordon Conwell Seminary back in Boston, I remember, and I was I was 32, and so I had a lot of these younger, gifted young men and women who were very idealistic about the local church, and I was very cynical. And I had already pastored a church in Mount Soledad in La Jolla for 3 years and experienced some of the most crazy pain and suicide and overdose and depression and sexual, just in a small, and within 3 years, our church grew from 100 to 1,000. And I was hired. I had no idea what I was doing. So I'm 30 years old. I had no idea. I had a passion for Jesus, but I had no idea how to function in that environment. And I got eaten up. And I said, I can't do this anymore. So I escaped from the local church to go to seminary.
Well, so you actually, thank you for preempting one of my questions. I was going to ask you you were doing a good job of describing the church climate that, existed when you encountered Jesus. Mm-hmm. And then I was asking you to diagnose kind of our current cultural moment, and you just did. And what I heard you say is that you see the institutional church as it's losing cultural power or influence or significance, where they regressed to adopting the tactics or the ethics of the surrounding culture. So it's a preservationist mentality. It's one that it says, well, yeah, how do we hang on to the cultural influence or the economic power that we have? How do we preserve our numbers and these, how do we keep alive these organizations that grew up and gave us this sense of security? It's a very, as you mentioned, sectarianism. So there's there isn't a collaborative spirit. There's a competitive spirit. So often between churches, between denominations.
It's so subtle.
Yeah. But that's one of the reasons why I'm curious about what's going on, what God has been doing in and through you, is because, so you're working for this local church for like 30 years, but at the same time, you then found. You start writing this curriculum, which I know is the men's and women's skills and marriage skills and leadership skills, that is trying to paint a different picture, trying to paint a picture of emotionally healthy spirituality. I know Pete Scazzaro is really influential for you there. Mm-hmm. And then instead of saying, well, hey, no, I'm just going to keep it to our church, and like, if you got to come, if you want to be a part of this, you got to come be a part of what we're doing here. You found a nonprofit with this vision to try and say, hey, no, actually, I want to basically give this away to churches. I want to help resource communities who are interested in developing alternative paths forward of healing and of discipleship and of spirituality. So what inspired you to go to, while still working for a church, create this separate nonprofit and develop these curriculum and try and help resource churches that you're not a part of?
Yeah. So that great question. I'm going to kind of give you touch a little bit more on my story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it was 15 years into my position as a marriage and family pastor. I still had a lot of baggage. There were a lot of issues in my life that I still was wrestling with. And one of those, and we've talked about this on our podcast, is I was exposed to pornography, when I was 11, 12 years old. And then I wasn't raised in a Christian home, went to USC and just lived this very promiscuous, crazy lifestyle. And so when I got radically saved, I went through a honeymoon period experiencing God's love and His grace. But then there came to a point where all of a sudden this baggage stuff started coming back up, realizing that I still have these lustful temptations of looking at pornography. I know I had anger issues that were attached to that. I had deep shame. So part of as I reflect back on my own story, is here I've been at this church for 15 years, knowing that God's used me, seeing people's lives come to know Christ and so forth. But at the same time, I'm recognizing my own life as well as many other people who have been in the church. I don't see people changing. Mm-hmm. I don't see people growing.
Yeah.
I don't see people becoming more loving and caring. And so I'm reflecting on my own life, why am I still living in this place? If I'm really believing Jesus has healed me and set me free, I'm still struggling with maybe some compulsive or addictive attitudes and behavior. So that's when I decided I need to go, I can't figure this out. And I would probably say the biggest issue that I encountered as a pastor was burnout. Because that's part of my drivenness is why am I constantly, I am probably part of my story was I mastered in burnout. And then recognizing even more recently in the last, I think about 2 years ago during COVID, I started struggling with depression, and I'd never struggled with depression before. So this is when I decided I got to go figure out about myself. And that's when I went back and got my master's in marriage family therapy. And I began this deeper search of my own heart and beginning to understand myself as well as understanding the inner self, understanding why other people aren't growing in their faith and what's hindering that journey. And so that's when I began this journey of my own healing and then having to face some dark secrets that I was withholding from even my wife at the time. And my children and, my daughter at the time was 14, my son was 12. And that's when that was exposed and I hit the kind of D-Day of my life. And so my wife and I,
rock bottom number two. And really interesting, I see myself, how many conversion moments have we all had?
Yeah. So I probably had about 4 or 5 conversion experience that I've hit rock bottom. And I reflect back on those moments now as they're the greatest gifts of my life. Is coming to a place of desperation at the end of myself is now not looking at a place of shame and guilt of those moments, but really seeing them as essential doorways, in many ways strangely wrapped gifts of discovering the goodness and the grace of the Lord. So that's when I went back to school and I began to do more research and how do I implement this into my ministry, and that's when I begin to write the curriculum, the men's skills curriculum, and integrate emotional, behavioral, psychological, neuroscientific truths that only reinforce biblical reality and biblical truth. So I wanted to bring in these truths to only reinforce and to be able to reframe and rethink our brain by using other language that we become so familiar with biblical language where it loses its meaning and power. So that's kind of the passage the journey that I've been on.
So I'm kind of curious. The one thing that you had mentioned earlier, I wanted to circle back to, is that you were saying, when you were describing how you and some of your peers, as you've been reflecting on our cultural moments, say, "Hey, it's darker now. It's more complex now." And then in your counseling and your pastoral practice, and in the group like recovery and healing modality that we practice, you see, man, there's the spiritual component, spiritual darkness, demonic influence, and that sort of this kind of sometimes sensationalized aspect of spirituality that can be kind of controversial. You see that on one hand, and then you're also seeing, like you said, the emotional damage, trauma. You understand that neurobiology might be a component of what's going on here. Family systems, broken family systems are part of to blame. So I'd like to have a little bit of a conversation about that. What's been your experience about trying to hold the tension of these things? Do we give too much weight to spirituality? Do we give too much weight to the therapeutic realm? Is it even possible to separate or to parse out these different things? What's a healthy vision of healing and of psychology and emotional, health?
Wonderful. I mean, that's again. Thank you for asking that question. It's like walking a tightrope. And I do remember when I jumped into my graduate program, MFT, and when it was an more ecumenical. I'd say it's more progressive, more liberal. And so there were believers, there were different backgrounds, and then there were those who were non-believers. When they found out that I'm a Calvary chapel pastor,
Yeah.
I was labeled as, because our institution was very fundamental.
Right.
Okay, and we don't need to get into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Different conversation.
That's a different conversation. But then I was labeled as this conservative white man fundamentalist.
Yeah.
And I was, in many ways, there was tension. Then when I went back into the Calvary Chapel world and was working and facilitating and developed a counseling center, I had people in the religious community, when they found out I'm going to get my master's in MFT, they realized, but that's not godly. Psychology is anti-God. So what are you doing in that world? So I found myself in both. I was walking this tightrope, and understanding that people were misunderstanding me on both spectrums and both systems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
So, so what I've learned is the question that, and we've had this discussion, and what do we do with mental illness? What is the church? How is the church to deal with addiction? How is the church going to deal with people who are encountering abuse or depression or or mood disorders? Well, and as a marriage and family pastor, I just thought, well, if you just read the Bible and pray for them,
right?
God is going to heal them. And I realized it's not working, and it's not even working in my own life.
Right.
So I think that the journey, it wasn't that psychology, because I do believe that, the essence of psychology, the origin of psychology was very it's really more humanistic, and it's very grounded in our human perspective reality, Freud. But at the same time, there's been now, with so much scientific research, we now know from the human behavioral standpoint, these truths only reinforce why we need more of Jesus, or only reinforces why the truth of the gospel is so much more relevant. So understanding is the church, how safe has the church been for people who struggle with bipolar? How safe have people been who struggle with addiction to alcoholism or toward sex or to drugs? And historically, I would say, especially in the last 20 years, and research indicates by Barna Group, in the last 20 years, over 20 million evangelical, Christ-believing church attenders have walked away from the church. They've walked away. So that's a lot. And so we're seeing more than ever before is these people are leaving the institutional church. They say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, but they're leaving the church. So you
think that's because they're not experiencing change? They're not experiencing the church as a place that actually has the resources or the capacity to help them navigate the challenges?
Institutionally, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would argue a step further that because we've just covered that it can be an unsafe place for these demographics and groups of people, that it's not a place where people can make a home in a lot of situations. If that makes any sense.
You're absolutely.
Totally.
So it's a twofold.
Yeah.
And so I numerous times I've come to this place, I can't do this anymore, I'm leaving the church. And my place of cynicism, or the place of cynicism in my own doubt, would cause me to want to leave. And yet God made it very clear, no, that's why I have you there. And to be a light and to be an influence. And the reality is, I do love the church. I do love the church, and we're flawed. We're flawed people. We're all flawed people. We're all broken people. And the church, the institutions, every institution in our culture, more than ever before, is broken. Marriages are broken. So it isn't a matter of creating this kind of toxic positivity for people to come on Sunday mornings and just, I'm all for worship and prayer. I love it. And to meet God. But until we take them deeper, and this is where I think, understand that I wrote this book of the journey, I believe, of holistic, transformational, integrated, emotional well-being, discipleship is starting slow, starting slow, small, but going deep is the journey. That's the life of Jesus. And it's just not about programs. It's not about the process. It's not just about people. It's really about sitting with people in a safe place and creating an environment where they feel cared for and loved, and we can, as those in the church, we can sit with them in their pain and learn how to be empathetic and compassionate, and trust that God heals us through empathy and brokenness and openness and transparency. And we need to do that not on just Sunday mornings, but it's the lifestyle of what true spirituality is all about. Am I making any sense?
All the sense.
We'd like more of that sense.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what I hear you say. It's not that there isn't utility or value in the left in the institutional church and left in the the corporate gatherings. Like there is value there.
Absolutely.
But really, that's not the place of transformation. Largely, people can have encounters. They can taste community in those settings, or they could maybe encounter truth, from Scripture, or encounter the presence of the Spirit, of love and healing and acceptance. But really, to get down to the roots of where our identity is, requires, as you said, safety. I heard you describe, safe places, slowness, to begin a slow work, not of this slap you on the forehead, you're healed, sort of thing, but understanding that we as humans are incredibly complex and we have multiple layers. We're like onions. But that it takes time in the context of safety to begin to investigate our own stories. I've loved that we've kind of had this conversation through the lens of the different stages of your story, because obviously you've done a lot of work in your own story and understanding, what were those things that contributed to me as Jeff developing an identity that was really tethered to my performance, that leads me to burnout? Yeah. Or that led me to seeking meaning or escape in a promiscuous lifestyle, right? You've excavated that. Well, a lot of people haven't. A lot of people, their paths are painful. There's trauma, there's abuse, there's neglect, there's all sorts of stuff, and they just, I don't want to go there. I just want to move forward. Yeah. But that as much as we can do that requires kind of a grit your teeth, grin and bear it sort of mentality that ultimately, as you said, it'll come back around until we allow Jesus.
If we run harder away from it.
Yeah.
No, it outruns us.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that it makes for unhealthy people.
Yeah.
Making unhealthy decisions and perpetuates harm and
Yeah.
To elaborate, but yeah.
So what we've had this conversation is what hinders spiritual growth in grace and mercy and love and discovering our identity. What hinders our ability to integrate truth into our souls and discovering who we are, and with that discovering our purpose in life? Well, I've discovered there's really 4 different, it's pretty simple, make this real practical, is the first one I'm discovering, you need to know your story. So you need to understand, unless you grow and learn from your history, you're condemned to repeat your history. Right? So we have to be able to see that our life is significant meaning, and every one of us has a major, powerful story. Even in our craziness, as we want to dismiss, deny, and just kind of pull away from that my life really doesn't matter. So sitting with people to help them to understand who they are is part of the healing process, so knowing your story. The second hindrance is, I think it's busyness. I don't have time. I'm too busy. I've got a family to take care of. I got to pay the bills. And that's the part of our culture is this busyness is one of the major hindrances, and I think it's one of the greatest addictions of our culture is busyness. because we don't have time to really deal with ourselves, which leads to burnout. The third one, I believe, and Brendan Manning talks about this, is self-contempt. Is deep, deep shame. We just feel like I'm a loser, or which hinders us from want to begin to unpack our story. But this sense of feeling what's wrong with me, and I don't deserve to be loved, and I'm not loved, and so that sense of core belief, our brokenness, is what hinders us not only from loving others, but we can't love unless we're first experienced love. Jesus says, he basically says we love because he first loved us. So we have to learn to, in our humility and brokenness, to be so dependent in our finiteness on slowing down and being with God. And that's why we've discovered in these small groups, we've been able to sit with people and help them to uncover their story. And then the last one I would say is what I call toxic spirituality or hyper spirituality. Is you go to church and they say, hey, you're good, you're forgiven, life's good, you don't need to deal with your past anymore, and so that sense of unhealthy spirituality and hyper spirituality is when we go to church, I call it toxic positivity or compulsive goodness. It's like, we're just, you have a fight with your spouse, you're going to church, you're just in a bad place, you go to church, you step on the church grounds and you run in. How you doing? Hey, I'm doing great. Yes, we're super,
God's good.
God's good. And then you get back in the car and you're like, you bring up all that stuff. But, I don't know if this is making any sense to any of you, but it's realizing, and this is what I've discovered in my own journey in understanding the church. And I'm not here, the last thing I ever want to do is sit here to criticize or attack. I'm here to help in God's grace, that we need to have the courage to self-evaluate, not only ourselves individually, but the church needs to have the courage to self-evaluate and reflect and see where are our blind spots, how we can become more loving people.
So the 4 hindrances to healing: people not knowing their story, so being like unconscious of the ways that our family histories have shaped us, the ways that the culture or the religion that we were born into has formed for ill or for health, our sense of self-worth, identity, what a vision of the good life looks like. I think your second one, busyness, names a lot of our addiction to materialism and to consumerism. Like we're busy trying to make a buck, we're busy trying to spend a buck. And that third one I really like, self-contempt, or this sublimated shame, because a lot of people don't initially. I found in some of the work that we've done together that a lot of people don't initially think that they experience shame a lot. But in part just because that they have sublimated, they've shoved that down. But really, they then realize that, oh well, so many of my attempts, my bids for love and my bids for value, where, oh man, I'm trying really hard. I only feel good about myself when I'm getting positive feedback from work, or when I'm when I'm succeeding or accomplishing something. Really, what's happened there is that they don't think that they're just enough being who they are. Or there's this sense of brokenness. That's where so much of the addiction comes from too, is trying to medicate or escape this sense of defectiveness that we carry around and oftentimes can't name. And then, I love that last one, toxic or hyper spirituality, compulsive goodness, or toxic positivity. We've all met those sorts of people, right? Like when, and been those.
You've met me.
Yes. Yeah. I've been that. I've been that as well. It's really uncomfortable to bring like your broken self into your everyday, to like give yourself permission to be somebody who's doesn't have it all together, and who doesn't have an unwavering faith in God's goodness, who questions sometimes whether or not he is a loving, active, present God who's for our healing good.
And I want to add to that, because as I am getting more free and discovering my identity and experience more God's grace as mercy, I am more fulfilled. I am more joyful. I can be with people when people walk on the campus and and be positive and be kind and good. The problem is if it's done out of compulsivity, then there's a difference between that's not walking in the Spirit, that's walking in our flesh. And at the same time, out of that sense of joy and positivity and goodness, if I'm walking in the Spirit, I'm going to be sensitive and compassionate for people who are not in that place.
Right.
And I can be more caring and more discerning. It's not about just me. It's not about me just trying to work up some sort of attitude. It's me learning to be in a place, walking in God's love and His grace, to sit with people that are not doing well and feeling this is a safe place. We're so welcome. I'm so glad you're here. How can we help you? So the other thing is, you talk about the self-contempt is on the other continuum of the spectrum. Is self-contempt is we can go to a place of I'm a loser, there's something wrong with me, and how do we deal with that in our pain? The other unhealthy way is if I can compare myself, well, I'm not as bad as that person, or I know the Bible better than that person. And that the other end of the spectrum we don't understand is what drives shame is self-righteousness. Is coming to that place, well, no, I'm a lot better than that person. And, so that's in an unhealthy way. How do we deal with our deep pain is through comparison. And that is pretty relevant in the church today. Comparison, and which then leads to, I think one of the greatest seductive temptations for people in the church is jealousy.
Well, not just, I think all the things you just said do apply to the church. I think it's something that we see in broader culture in general. We live in the age of the image and the visual age, where we are freely, it's shifting rapidly now as we're kind of renegotiating our relationship to these technologies that we developed, that we carry around in our pockets, that give us unending and instant access to the entire world of knowledge, but also the lives of millions of people who are freely sharing and posting, mostly only their best and shiniest moments, or their deep pain and bitterness, So it's an issue that isn't exclusive by any means to the church. Well, Jeff, I so appreciate you just sharing some of your story and some of the wisdom that you've, found, and painting a little bit of a better vision for what a healthy spirituality could look like. Clara, if you've got any other questions, then feel free to fire away. But I think one reason when we were talking about having you on as a guest, it's, as I kind of mentioned earlier, we work with a lot of people, and a lot of people who are our audience as well are people who are interested in moving out to the margins, moving out to posture themselves in the broken places of the world that have a need for health and healing and hope. And I think a lot of, that was in part the vision behind the podcast that you and I developed, 3 to Love, was saying, hey, how can we offer people a resource who might not have a church or have a spiritual community that's safe, as we've acknowledged, that or isn't just resourced to help people to grow and to understand. So understand their journey and to overcome the obstacles to healing. And so I'm so grateful for the work that you've done and continue to do, and want to help elevate and broadcast this message that you've got, because I think it's a needed one.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a joy being here with you. And I think I just, being a counselor and a pastor, my question is, is this relevant for, is this relevant for you guys? Anything that you can reflect on your own story, to reflect on, I've been there, I've experienced that, or I know this is the journey I'm on. I'm just wondering if those questions are relevant or make sense to you.
I think definitely, as people who are in a business where we deal with people and help people and both have a heart for people, I think it's definitely prevalent to understand how your own story and experiences inform the world, and how it informs your interactions with others, and how you can, in your capability and capacity to sit with others in their brokenness. One question I had for you specifically is, what does it look like to befriend that brokenness, both in yourself and in others, that slow process? What does that kind of look like in real time?
I think the key word you just said, and I really appreciate you, it's a powerful word. I think it's really relevant to spiritual well-being and healthiness, is we have to befriend. our humanness. We have to embrace our limitations. We have to be able to accept the idiosyncrasies and those broken areas of our lives, whether it be physically, emotionally, psychologically, even dealing with trauma, deep trauma in our life. And so if we don't befriend it, we're not going to integrate it into our life. If we don't embrace it, then we're going to continue to live disintegrated. Mm-hmm. We're not going to be people of integrity. We're going to be disintegrated. Mm-hmm. And it's our natural instinctive tendency to not befriend pain, mm-hmm. to befriend our brokenness, but to dismiss it, to ignore it. And as you talked about earlier, Joseph, it's like this, it'll come back to bite you. Mm-hmm. You can't, it's like a boomerang effect, you're like, I'm going to get rid of this. I don't have to deal with this anymore. I don't want to be like my dad. Boop. And it's boom, boom, boom. It's going to come back and it's going to bite you. It's going to hit you.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And because it isn't just it's not just an emotional, psychological issue. It's far deeper than that. So, yeah, I think we have to face our pain in order to experience healing from it, and going from pain to peace, learning to get out of our heads and learn to live in our hearts, and then learning to live from the inside out. How do I learn to accept and understand that I am loved and cared for by God? And to live in that place of wholeness and knowing that you are God's beloved. You're highly valued. We all are highly valued. We're God's beloved. And he sees us in the eyes of his son, Jesus. And he sees us in our potential. He sees you for who not only what you are, what you have been, or what you used to be. He sees you in what you are to be. And I think I love that having that sort of perspective, those lenses that God sees you prophetically as a powerful, amazing, beautiful, broken, caring human being. And if we see ourselves like that, we will see other people that way. If we see ourselves as wounded, dark, not broken, I use the difference between woundedness and brokenness. Brokenness is really a place when we experience healing in our woundedness, but we accept. Then we're able. If we're not kind to ourselves, we won't be kind to other people. It'll be harder for us to be kind to other people if we're not kind to ourselves.
So, love that distinction between woundedness and brokenness.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
Did I hear you right there? So for you, brokenness is having accepted our woundedness and beginning to experience healing there.
Yeah, and we never arrive.
Right.
Yeah.
The journey of sanctification in the Bible, sanctification or transformation, is an ongoing journey until the day we get set free from these bodies.
Right.
Could you also say that that's an aspect of wilderness and being in a type of wilderness? And do you ever leave it? Do you ever leave the wilderness? How would you qualify that?
Wow, we're going deeper now.
Let's go. Good work. Good one, Claire.
Yeah, Claire. So deep wilderness it's one of the major metaphors in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And of understanding is the wilderness is just not a dark, arid place absent of God's goodness and kindness. It is really the place of experiencing in the dark night of our soul. God meets us in the dark night of our souls. He meets us in that place in our wilderness when we feel all alone. And so, yeah, here's the reality. The question is, in our culture, are we seeing a wilderness culture? Unpredictability. Uncertain cultural climate changes. Not only just climate,
right?
Not just the
ecological sphere.
Not just ecological, but we're seeing psychological, emotional, cultural climate change, and our culture's changing so radically, which is an opportunity in this wilderness season for the light to shine, for us to be in that place of anchoring our love and grace, not in our culture, not in the institutional church, but in Jesus. And then God wants to use us as light of the world in these dark places.
Yeah. It's
Well, that's a conversation we've been having even here in the office of where do you find stability? What is the correct metaphor to use in how you center yourself in that position of identity, belovedness, security in that versus that of this world? And it's from that inner centered place where you find the grit and find the Holy Spirit, and you can be in that eye of the hurricane.
Yeah. And I really see you as a contemplative deep thinker. You know, I see you as you're an inner processor, and I can see how, you know, you in your personality and who you are in your countenance, I could see how you're one who is going to go deep and really begin to process and try to understand. And at the same time, but you're also most vulnerable to the inner battle, you know, the inner struggles of really accepting who am I and my value. And so, but that's I think that's the beauty of who you are and your personality and how God has created you, that you have so much to offer in your sensitivity, and you're a very compassionate, caring person.
Thank you.
Nailed it. She is all those things and many more. You know, I heard you, Claire, asking this really powerful and practical question of what does it look like to befriend? And you gave a great response, Jeff, just talking about the importance of that. And as I was hearing you talk, I was kind of looking down at the 4 obstacles to healing that you named for us, and wondered actually if those are the flip side of those are these pretty practical ways, like, hey, what does it look like to befriend our brokenness? What does it look like to become people of integrity, people of peace? Which, you know, Mark Sayers wrote a great book called A Non-Anxious Presence, and he kind of identified that, hey, in a period of increasing stability, you know, communally and globally, that the thing that the world needs is people of peace, people of non-anxious presence, people who can sit in uncertain, chaotic, traumatic, violent times and spaces, and to not become reactive, to not perpetuate that violence or that abuse, but to be people of peace, people who are able to be a safe refuge for others, and to make wise decisions from that space. So I love that you're kind of already painting that picture for us. And on that practical, how do you befriend your brokenness? You know, you named the obstacles as not knowing your story, and as busyness, and as self-contempt, and as toxic or hyper-spirituality. And I was kind of going, oh, well, if those are the obstacles, what would the practical flip sides look like? Well, it would be to know your story. We've talked about that a lot. Part of befriending your brokenness is getting to know, where did it come from? Who wounded you and when? You know, because until we can identify that, then we can't really begin to heal it. We can't really begin to forgive the people who have hurt us or the ways that we've hurt ourselves. Another practical way, you said busyness is an obstacle. So slowness and simplicity in a culture of abundance and you know, noise, slow down, and in some ways to tune out of all the arguing voices, and to try and listen to that still small voice. Then you said in self-contempt, well, a practice then of self-compassion, of being empathetic towards our own, as I heard you say, our own limited, wounded selves. That it's like, well, hey, I am not just defined by my woundedness or my brokenness or my self-contempt. You know, I am a finite creature who's got unique gifts and unique limitations, and that's okay. That's self-compassion. And then the last one, you said the toxic or hyper-spirituality, or that compulsive goodness that wants to push away all dark emotion or experience. That's countered actually by this healthy, robust faith and spirituality that makes space intentionally for lament and for grief and for the fact that, hey, you know, we go through wilderness seasons where we feel desolate and alone, and we need to be able to give voice to those. And actually, that's the beautiful part of the Christian tradition, is that it includes the Psalms of Lament. It includes the Ecclesiastes. You could open the Bible and not just find, hey, the good news of the fact that, you know, but you could find a mirror that's actually reflecting the immediate moment that you had, this one of decadence and of discontent and disillusionment with the fact that like, well, hey, I've tasted success, wealth, glory, whatever, and it's not, it hasn't brought me meaning or peace.
Yeah.
So, that was my best attempt at your practical response to that question of how do we befriend our brokenness.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I think getting back to, on a very practical, pragmatic, what does that look like structurally? And I think if there's a movement, if we're going to see, which I describe is personal revival is preceded by personal brokenness. Mm-hmm. So until we come to the end of ourselves and we begin the process and the journey of our own healing, then we'll just fall right back in. So that's why, we've discussed is the simplicity and the mandate of the gospel on a practical basis is the Great Commission. Go. Jesus spends 3 years living with these 12, not just 12 men, but he had a whole team, men and women that he lived with for 3 years. Only for 3 years. He's 33 years old. He was crucified and was 33. And then he says, in his resurrected state, just before he takes off to be with his Father, he says, go and make disciples of, I give you authority to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so the simplicity of it's just not, I agree. I love Sunday mornings. Bringing people together in a community, it does build a sense of hope and inspiration. But at the essence of living the life is in small groups, grace-centered, grace-filled environment, safety, confidentiality, and meditating and reflecting on the teachings of Christ. And I think that's the journey. How long does that take?
As long as you got.
It should be the rhythm of our life. It really should be, because if not, goes back to a place of busyness, shame, isolation. We're always going to regress back to where our culture is going to take us back to, and which is, part of the dark side is a place of feeling all alone and that orphan mentality. So, so really, I think what we've been experiencing, I know you've been, you and Daryl have been co-leading a group of men, and just it's been beautiful to hear some of these men come and tell me how it's changing their lives, and just the wisdom that you and Daryl have. And it's not that you're teaching,
right?
You're there, you're kind of orchestrating and creating an environment where people have a voice and to talk, but you do have great wisdom in asking the right question at the right time to the right person and helping them begin to discover. So I'm just really grateful for you and the team we have of people who are now discipling and pouring into other people's lives. So,
well, I hope that there's a movement that I hope the movement that you're describing, this vision that you're offering of what healthy, spirituality and community could look like, is one that takes off. I know it will take off slowly because it's just a crucial aspect of its practice.
Yeah.
This isn't something that goes viral. It's something that slowly works its way through communities and through lives and through relationships. So, well,
it's all on your generation now, because my generation, it's all. I don't want to put any pressure on you guys, but it's all on you guys now.
Jeff, we already struggle with performance anxiety. No, Jeff, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. We try and end with this thing called hot takes, which I didn't prepare. Sometimes we prepared like a big list. I think I only have like 1 or 2 questions that come to me off the top of my head. So, and 2 of them hot takes. So this is just like real quick. What's your opinion or your answer here? What is the hardest pitch to throw?
I really think it's the forkball.
Really?
I think it's,
What was your best pitch?
My most effective pitch was the overhand curveball. Yeah, it was really effective, and Yeah. And then I started trying to throw the splitter. We called it back then the forkball. It's called the splitter. But it's probably one of the most effective pitches today, the hot pitch. But I didn't learn it back then. I wish I had. Darn it.
Well, the outside of the season, who are you calling to win the pennant this year? Who's going to win the World Series?
Oh, that's really emotional for me, So, yeah. So this is the thing is, this is crazy. So I was raised an Angel fan.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So it's like, but they got potentially the two of the best players.
Totally.
Shohei Ohtani and Mike Trout. So I love these guys, but if they get rid of Shohei Ohtani, I'm going to become a Padre fan. Okay, I'm in that process right now. But the Padres aren't doing that well. I went to the Padre game the other night, and I realized, if I divorce the Angels, I can't just give them up and jump into another relationship.
You got to take a time of
I have
grieving
to take my time
and
grieving and healing and that process. I just can't let go of my whole life,
Yeah. Oh man, is it becoming this unintentional thing that like in some way we will end up talking about baseball?
In my experience, yeah.
There you go. Who are you? Are you a baseball fan?
Not really.
Okay, good.
I mean, I grew up in
great.
the Dodgers, but
you don't have to get attached to these 27-year-old men.
Yeah.
That's funny.
It's really funny. I don't know if I have a hot take as what it would be called as a hot take, but I want to know what you're reading right now.
Ooh.
That's a great question. So where I am right now is, I think I've been on this season of inner healing, and I have not been in an intellectual philosophical pursuit. I've been practicing a lot of Lectio Divina.
Nice.
So I think it's been life-changing for me to just every day I listen to auditory, the Word of God, in the morning and at night. And I just sit there and I just reflect and close my eyes and listen. And then if I sense God speaking to me, I'll go back and read it, and then read it again, and then reflect. So it's really been a powerful tool. And I don't know if the people know what Lectio Divina is, but it's really just more contemplation and receiving, not just study.
Yeah.
But it's more about just sitting and receiving and trying to hear the voice of God through His Word. So
I also have a Lectio practice, and it is deeply restful and transformative.
The only thing I need to do, because if you do understand, if you've studied, I think his name is Thomas, and the different ways we hear the voice of God. Some people hear it from nature. Some people through more stoicism. And so I find myself that I am an activist and a caretaker, which is really interesting. I'm an activist. I want to see radical change, but I'm a caretaker. I would like to become more of a naturalist. I wish I could spend more time fishing with, going out fishing with Joseph, because that's what he meets God out there and fly fishing. So,
I have one last question I realized, and it was a question I wanted to ask earlier, because you described yourself, you've come to understand a lot of your calling in life is to act as a coach. It's not so much a therapist, it's not so much a pastor. And I really like that because, therapist and pastor are kind of loaded roles and loaded terms, and sometimes require training and specialization. And so it could feel out of reach for a lot of people who might just be listening to this. But coaching is something that we see throughout our culture, right? Yeah. Not just in the sports space, but in the career space. We just had Roy Nzunza on the podcast, and he was talking about his corporate chaplaincy and about faith in the workplace and how good leadership is lots of ways. Like it's not this authoritative, top-down sort of thing. It's this coming alongside, this coaching, encouraging. So how would you define and how do you understand like this idea of being a coach?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so it's interesting. I might have shared this with you, but I had this prophetic word spoken over to me about a year and a half ago. And the guy came up to me, and I didn't even know who the guy was. He's this supposedly prophet from, from Shreveport, Louisiana. And he just didn't know. Rob and I were sitting there in this church service, and he comes up and he goes, you are a counselor. And then he paused and said, no, you're a counselor that's your vocation, but you're a coach by nature. And then he said this, and this helps you to answer your question. He said, counselors and pastors have a tendency to speak truth into them. You have a coach have the gift to be able to bring the truth out of them, to see who they really are and to bring that out of them. And he said, so you have as a coach, you're able to help them to understand their true identity as a follower of Christ. So, and I would say on a more practical basis as a coach is that we're more pro-growth, we're more focused on the positive, I'm more exhorting and encourager, I'm an encourager, I'm an influencer, so I want to bring truth out of them and then help them to understand how do they go from crisis to their character and identity to their calling. So as a coach, I want them not just to sit as a therapy and understand their brokenness, but I want them to understand their purpose and their meaning in life.
Dude, that's great.
Beautiful.
That's great. Jeff Reinke, always a pleasure, man. Thanks for coming by the Nation's office and talking your journey, talking healing, talking brokenness, talking baseball,
Well, we gotta get together. We gotta do episode 2, right?
Yeah, season 2 of the Free to Love podcast.
People are asking when's the next season coming out. So,
right,
I can't do this without you.
Well, that dear diary, I feel very encouraged and validated. We should have guests on who are so as encouraging as him more often.
Very uplifting.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless.
Cut.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you
really
so
enjoyed
much.
it. Yeah. Thanks for.